Hi, and we're live. So welcome back to another live edition with Kobo Writing Life. And I'm really pleased to welcome Jane Friedman here today.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us virtually. We were just discussing working from home and how you're a well-versed pro.
Indeed, yes, I've been work at home since 2014, so I've been fortunate that my routine hasn't been that affected except for conference travel.
Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. And just to give a little bit of kind of context for the next hour or so, anyone that's watching, feel free to leave a comment and then we'll get to those throughout the chat. And if we don't get to them, I'll answer them at the end. And we'll sort of just pick up as we go along. But other than that, yeah, we can get started. So Jane, you've been working in sort of the book and publishing industry for many moons now, and a wealth of knowledge always on the book business. For anyone that doesn't really is not familiar with your work or your writing, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I've been working in publishing in some form since the late 90s. Most of the first half of my career was spent at a traditional publisher, F&W Media. More people know me from my work at Writer's Digest, which was one of the specific communities at F&W Media. So after I left Writer's Digest, I taught for a while. I did some editing at the Virginia Quarterly Review, a literary journal, and then I went full-time freelance in 2014. So since 2014, I've mainly focused on doing industry reporting, commentary on the business of authorship. I have a book, The Business of Being a Writer. And then
It's on Kobo if anyone would like to check it out, both
Indeed.
the ebook and the audiobook. It's
Yes.
really a very good resource.
Thank you. And so I still do a lot of online teaching, in-person teaching, editing, and consulting, but most of my work is focused on what's happening in the industry and helping authors understand the business.
Yeah, I think that's very needed in the industry to have sort of somebody summarize this because it's such a fast moving thing. And especially when, like, since you kind of launched in 2014, like, I guess you had no idea how things would change throughout.
True. I mean, I had no idea how things, I mean, even just like year to year, I think there are changes that happen that I wouldn't entirely have been able to predict. Makes me always very cautious about making predictions.
Oh, well, I'm still going to ask you later for some predictions. But we can just like caution them with like just
Yes.
a warning, like may not be predicted. But so speaking of kind of uncertain or unforeseen events, I was wondering if we could kind of, the biggest thing with the book industry right now has been the COVID-19 crisis and how the pandemic has affected book sales and, what people are reading, how they're reading. At Kobo, we really at the beginning noticed a swell of new readers, especially in Europe, where it was funny to see it sort of stagger as the lockdown sort of happened aggressively at the beginning. So what are the main points that you are seeing that are coming out of this situation that we all see ourselves in?
It's really stunning. So to talk about predictions you could have never made. In the United States, the print market has been very resilient. So if you look at, just retail sales, I mean, I can't speak to libraries really, or things that might be happening on a wholesale level. But if you just look at print sales through retailers, they're up versus last year, which is incredible. And part of it is because so much has moved online. But if you go into some other markets like the UK, for instance, they're not showing the same kind of resilience. And so it's almost like on a market by market basis. Every market's behaving very differently.
Yeah.
In Europe in particular, I think there's been much more adoption of subscription models, digital resources. And that's not to say that hasn't happened in the US. Ebook sales are up in the US as well. But it's interesting to see that there's, because of the need and the demand for entertainment and for access when stores are closed, I think we're seeing a return to some resources, maybe even new recognition that these resources exist, especially on the library side where they're saying, like I attended an American Libraries Association roundtable where librarians were saying they're getting lots of new patrons who are making use of digital resources when before, these weren't patrons. They're just now coming to realize what's available. So yeah, services like Kobo Plus and Storytel, which is predominant in Europe, Kindle Unlimited in the US, all of these services, all indicators show that they're in a very strong position. But at the same time, again, remarkably, print endures, at least in the US. As I said, UK, it's unclear yet what will happen.
I was wondering what was going to happen with the print because, at Kobo, it's not our focus as we're really just thinking about digital, but just out of my own curiosity of the book business, when we saw a lot of publishers shifting their release dates to further in the year because of like wanting to do the big print release, it's interesting to see how like print is still kind of as popular even with the physical stores not opening. But I guess some of them are maybe open again, depending on where.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the stores have reopened in some form. It's just not what it used to be. So there's maybe a limited number of people in the store at a time, or it's by appointment, or, there are all sorts of restrictions, and it depends on where you go. And I think in the UK, there's even more like a more gradual reopening than there has been in the US. Yeah. But in any event, something that has helped the bookstore market in the United States is this very serendipitous launch of something called Bookshop. And this is an online retailer that was started in the US, meant to compete against Amazon. And when it launched, there was this feeling like a David and Goliath feeling, like
we know that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Like, okay, I mean, good for you. You're trying to support independent bookstores. That's the goal of the site because it funnels its profits into the independent bookstore community. So it launched in January. Of course, no one knew what was about to happen really at that point. And the pandemic fueled its growth. And, it was able to achieve in 3 months what it had set out to do in really 3 years. Wow. And so they are selling some ebooks, but their predominant business is print. So, and then there just have been current events as well have propped up book sales, both print and digitally. So Black Lives Matter and social justice issues, anti-racism, all of this has created new bestsellers that, I don't think we would have seen. They're now in the top 10, like the How to Be an Anti-Racist book, White Fragility. So people are buying those because of current events. There's also the political books about the Trump administration that are breaking records for the publishers who release them. So that is also, I don't know that authors always recognize how a single bestseller can move a publisher or even the entire industry into a positive when it had been on the decline, sometimes called the Harry Potter effect. So that's also happening, and it's been very good for publishers.
Wow. So it's good. So overall, the book biz is doing better than, I guess we could have anticipated at the beginning of this crisis.
It has. And I think anyone who's been in the industry a very long time could have probably told you that it would have weathered the storm maybe better than other industries. Publishing has typically done well during recessions or depressions because people usually don't give up their books, or they find some way to get them.
And how do you think that marketing has changed as a result of this? Have you seen different practices in how people are releasing their titles?
I think there was a lot of anxiousness around whether people should continue business as usual to release their books. And I don't see that concern as often right now. It was definitely top of mind in March and April when there was more uncertainty. That's not to say there is less uncertainty now, but I guess, we're all getting accustomed to this new normal, whatever that is. And people realize that there is a market and there is a hunger for books that help people either understand what is happening, help them deal with what is happening, help them escape from what is happening. So fiction writers, novelists, people who write romance or crime thriller or things that help people, take a break from the current event cycle. I think people are realizing there's a need to keep on with those, and they can still find a market for them.
Yeah, we definitely saw an increase at the beginning in like romantic comedies, kind of just like positive stories, but then it sort of swiftly went into the kind of mystery fantasy as like it moved from like wanting to the positive to more of an escapism. So it was interesting to watch that trend unfold.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
speaking of the kind of like not political events, but when there's it's kind of interesting that an author, especially like an indie author, would have to consider all of these mountains of things that are happening in the world when it comes to their book releases. For the US in particular, we've heard of some authors kind of like reconsidering a November release date just because it might be kind of lost in the void of just the news that's going out. Do you think that's a valid thing to consider when you're releasing, to just for 2020 in general, or even just like when there's any sort of major world event?
It really depends on the sort of author and sort of title we're talking about. So, for example, a traditional publisher, especially a big five publisher, if you look at the release dates over the year, like if we plotted them out on a graph, you would see the graph just go down in November because no big publisher wants to release an important book in November. And
that's a good tip for indie authors, actually. We should creep on the major publishers' release dates. I'm writing that down.
So I can understand that attitude from traditional publishers because some books really depend on media attention, review attention, merchandising, and other patterns related to just how books get publicity. And the election is likely to take all the air out of the room.
Right.
For indie authors, though, there might be a different set of considerations. And if you have been around the block a few times, you've got a few books out, you probably know or have observed some patterns in your readership and what's a good time to release and how people respond. So, like if you have your own email newsletter list that you use, people who are really hoping for that next book in the series to come out on a particular schedule, maybe it's not a bad idea to release on a schedule that would normally put it out in November. You have it out before the holidays, especially, if your books would be good for gifting, if people want it for their vacations or their holiday breaks, maybe you go ahead and release. So it really just depends on the nature of the book and how you market them. But any book that depends on like a traditional publicity sort of push, I would probably avoid November.
Yeah, that's a good point, I guess, to especially in terms of indie, to you consider that you're kind of have presumably been training your readers to respond to a certain time period for each release. So
right.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's a good point. So one of the things that I really like about like the hot sheet and things that you do is that you really do have a 360-degree view of like writing and publishing. So you're not focusing on solely traditional or just independent or print and digital, like we've already been talking about both. So with our focus mostly is solely kind of being on independent authors that are widely published. Is there anything that you can provide to these authors in terms of advice for maintaining like a long-term writing career?
Well, one of the things I love about being here with you today, with Kobo in particular, is just I think authors need to be looking at wide options, wide distribution, and markets that go beyond the United States. And Kobo is, of course, so strong in this and having international reach. And where we're seeing a lot of growth in both ebook and audio right now is in those markets outside of the United States. So I'm also seeing authors who in genre fiction doing well with translations if they're doing their due diligence on their research about which genres are doing well in which of those European markets. It could be Germany, it could be France, it could be Italy, but we're seeing success in those areas, and also amazingly in not just audio, but translated audio. So audiobooks that, they originally came out in English and now you're translating them for the German market, because one of the important qualities of the audiobook market is most listening is local and in the local language. So to kind of summarize all of that into some bullet points, like growth is happening outside of the US. It's happening in subscription services. It's happening in libraries. It's happening in audio. And so Kobo is one important piece of reaching that broader market. And it's not that there isn't a time and place maybe for some exclusivity. I won't mention with whom. I think everyone knows. However, I think for long-term growth, which is what you asked about, you want to be reaching the largest market possible and not putting all of your eggs in that one proverbial basket.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's something that we definitely try and kind of reiterate with our authors, is that we're kind of positioned in this unique place where we do have the global view of things with such strong partners around the world. And yeah, I guess we can talk about the different kind of book formats for a while. So last week, Kobo launched Kobo Plus in Canada, which is our subscription service that we had previously in Belgium and the Netherlands, launched there in 2017. So we're super excited about this growing into the Canadian market. So why do you think people are leaning more towards like the subscription model reading at the moment?
It's interesting that it differs by market somewhat. Yeah. So like in Europe, the predominant model for listening and for for ebooks and for listening is subscription. This isn't true of the UK, at least not yet. So you'll just find, for instance, in Sweden, which that's where Storytel is based, and it's where the audiobook market is and subscription market might be said to be most mature. Fiction consumption is 50% audio. That's, I think, a really incredible statistic.
Yeah.
And I think it does indicate where, if I were going to make a prediction, where the market might be headed also in the United States and the UK and Canada over time. So I guess that's one of the big questions that's on my mind, is if the US will gradually become more of a subscription-oriented market. I mean, we see early on, this was back in 2012, there were several services competing at once for this market. There was Kindle Unlimited, there was Oyster, if anyone remembers that one. There's Scribd. And right now, really the only services that are competing in the US are Kindle Unlimited, and then Scribd is still there, and it has, or they say they've become profitable. And so they offer both ebooks and audiobooks. They've also got interesting partnerships, like they've had partnerships with the New York Times to try and increase their exposure and the number of people who just go to one place for all of their media. And you also, if you look on the other side of the audio market, the podcast and music market, you see Spotify, another European-based subscription service.
I know, I was going to say like Northern European too. I'm like, how do they know?
Yeah, I know. Right, exactly. So that's starting to take, they're starting to make some really interesting moves in terms of buying up like significant podcasts, buying up this IP, and trying to become the go-to place for audio entertainment and content. They haven't really got into audiobooks as of yet, but if they do, watch out. Like, I would be really fascinated to see what might happen there. And because Audible, which is the biggest service in the US, is not, I mean, it's sort of subscription based, but sort of not. Like, you get your one credit, which is kind of like, it's kind of like a unit sale under a subscription model. So it's not like Storytel at all. So yeah, that's what I see unfolding at the moment, and I'm just keeping a really close eye on, you know, what if there a tipping point gets reached in the US where people start to prefer these subscription services. And I think younger generations tend to lean more in that direction. So there's also that if there's a move away from unit sales, that's going to really put pressure on both authors and publishers to find business models that work. Because the big five have been very reluctant to put new titles, especially, into these services, accurately thinking that it can push down profitability.
Yeah. I think what we found with looking at our kind of subscription base of having had it in Belgium and the Netherlands for the 3 years so far, and especially with audiobooks as well, is that they're not always the same reader. Like it's like you're hitting an audience of 3 different people, basically, like, or even more, because it's like you have your ebook a la carte, you have your ebook subs, you have your audiobook a la carte, audiobook subscription readers. So it's really interesting to tap into that. And because what we found in Belgium and the Netherlands is that it hadn't actually hindered, a la carte sales. It's just sort of boosted the industry. So I'm really curious to see how this plays out in publishing as a whole.
Yes, agreed. Another interesting thing I just learned within the last couple of weeks is that a lot of the consumption on these subscription services is backlist oriented.
Hmm.
So, in some of the mature markets, it's like 70 to 80% backlist. And for those who don't know that term, it's older titles, titles that aren't new. Whereas the unit sales services like Audible are really heavily geared towards new release purchases. So that also, I think, adds to your point that the consumption patterns are different.
Yeah, definitely. I do think that independent authors are excellent at their backlist sales. They're always like pushing the backlist, maybe more so as like traditional publishers pay more attention to the front list. So yeah, I do think there's a boost for that, but I wonder how it will affect independent authors as they are already kind of doing a great job marketing those books.
Yes. Yes.
So let's talk about kind of audio in general. We talked a little bit about the different places that people are listening. And so do you foresee audiobooks just kind of increasing in the popularity as we've seen? Because it's not a new format, but it's kind of almost being treated like a new format. Even though like books on tape were a thing that you could, buy or get out of the library for years.
Yes.
So do you think podcasting has sort of leaded into this boom, or is it just, smart speakers and like, is that going to keep going?
I think it's the frictionless way that people can now listen to audio. So everyone in the US, at least, likely has some device with them at all times that
Yeah.
can play an audiobook. It's usually off your smartphone, or maybe it's in your car. And so, during the books on tape or CD era, it was a little more of a hassle. And, they were often abridged. They weren't readily available for every title because they were expensive to do, and the publishers weren't, they were very selective about what they did in audio. And so, of course, right now, since, I don't know, I want to say since around the early 2010s, it's been at least the last 5 years, if not the last like 8 years, uh, there's been double-digit growth. And this has been really driven by the devices that we all now have with us. Headphone sales are like double last year. So like people are really, it just indicates where the market's headed. But you mentioned something important, the smart speaker phenomenon. So this is also fueling some growth. And during the pandemic, we've seen families like gather around the smart speaker to listen to, a favorite book. And it's like the new, storytelling around the fire,
Yeah.
storytelling around the Alexa. So there are like these more opportunities now to listen to books, and publishers. The growth is like double digit year on year. So people are predicting, based on current growth rates, that the audio content, not just audiobook sales, but also podcast subscriptions, that revenue is going to surpass ebook sales by 2023, which is pretty incredible to imagine.
Yeah, that's crazy. Wow. So if I'm an author that has, a pretty, lengthy set of books, I've got 10 to 20, I've published ebooks, and I want to diversify the formats that I have. I want to think about wide. How do I decide whether audiobooks are right for me or maybe translations are right for me? I mean, in an ideal world, you would do both, but I tend to see that the costs being somewhat comparable. So
Yeah.
if you had to pick one or the other, like what would the factors be that you'd consider in that decision?
For just about any author, I would probably prioritize audio over translations.
Oh, interesting.
I think it's easier to get right for an independent author because there are like very specific services you can go to that you can trust will do a decent job. One of these places is Findaway Voices, but they're just one of several different types of services and distributors that can help you get professional production, can help you distribute to all the right places, both in the US and outside. There's also the wide exclusivity issue with audio, just like there is with ebooks,
Yeah.
if that wasn't clear earlier. So I definitely see indie authors making the wide choice for audio much more frequently, and rightly so. So in any event, with audio, I think it's much easier to see, oh, yes, this is a quality product. With translations, I think it's much harder. If I'm assuming the author isn't going to know the target language, it's
No, yeah.
harder to vet the quality of what's being produced. And there isn't like an easy one-stop shop sort of place you can go to say, I really want to crack open the Spanish market or the German market or the Italian market, and I'm going to go to this one distributor that covers that country and can help me market and merchandise in that language. So it's not just the challenge isn't just the translation, but then it's marketing in that country. And how do you know who to go to? How do you know what appeals to that market? And there are also cover concerns, like the cover likely will have to be redesigned to match what consumers think a good book looks like in that country. So, I mean, the list of challenges is a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean there isn't opportunity. I just think there are lots more issues to sort through than with audio.
And I guess with the audio, you can just expand your current marketing plan already that you're putting together because it's in your local language and you can control it more easily.
Exactly. Yeah, it doesn't call for a specialized marketing campaign.
Yeah. And so with your book, I noticed you didn't narrate it yourself. Was that a deliberate choice?
That was, I didn't even know the audiobook was coming out until a week before it released.
Would you have narrated it if you had the option? Because it's a nonfiction and, you're very much known for speaking and I see kind of experts in the field doing their own books. So I was just curious about the decision.
Yeah, if I was given the option, I would have done it. But I mean, I don't really care that they got a professional to do it. So no one's complained to me.
No. That was just my own curiosity. Yeah. I was just like, yeah.
It's a classic example of a publisher not communicating with their author. And the rights were licensed to another publisher, to Tantor. And so I never knew that again until it was practically up for sale. So too bad, but it's fine.
So with kind of independent authors, we often see more and more people being hybrid authors. So including this audio boom that we're talking about, do you think it's important for authors to retain their audiobook rights, or do you think it's good for them to kind of lean on publishers for assistance in the production costs? Because I know they can be costly, but so for example, like a Kobo Writing Life, you can upload your audiobook directly if you have one. It's not exclusive. You can publish wherever, and then you have access to like our global stores and partner stores and things like that. So just curious about what you're seeing in terms of people selling or retaining rights.
As of 2020, maybe even as of 2017, in fact, it's not possible to retain your audiobook rights if you're also selling a publisher your print and ebook.
Oh, interesting.
It's considered part of the core rights package at this point because they're so valuable. A publisher's not willing to give them up. Now, there are some smaller publishers and even some mid-size and larger publishers that aren't doing audio themselves, and they're really just farming it out to other places like Tantor, for instance, which I mentioned for my own audiobook, or even Audible. Some publishers have arrangements with Audible to do their audiobook production. So, it's rare at this point, if it's a new contract, that you're going to have those rights. The best most authors can do is say, well, if you haven't exploited or sold these rights within 2 years, then those rights revert to me, the author. So if you have an agent, they can help negotiate that sort of stipulation. Certainly, if you have a contract or a book out that predates the audiobook boom, it may be that you've retained those rights, or you could maybe get them back. But publishers are really coming through that backlist.
Oh man!
So it would be really hard, I think, unless the contract language were really explicit.
Yeah, we have noticed a lot of authors are getting their rights back from like an earlier kind of different contract. So that's been interesting to see. Rich wants to know what your cat's name is, as your cat passed there.
That's Zelda.
I miss her. You should bring her back.
She went back to her bed.
Oh, okay.
She got bored with the conversation.
Oh, what? Oh, no, that's great. So when we were talking about fiction in audio that you were saying kind of in Storytel being like 50%, which is amazing to me because in kind of quote unquote newer audio markets, which is not new, but it's kind of, I think, predominantly nonfiction seeing what we're selling in audio. Are you seeing the same thing, or do you think that there's room for different fiction areas to grow?
Gosh, I'm trying to remember now. The Audiobook Publishers Association does an annual survey to break down the market into that fiction versus nonfiction and children's. And I don't remember what the percentages are now, but I think fiction has a slight advantage if you're just rolling everything up. So it might be like 60%,
Oh, sweet.
70% fiction, 10% children's. But when we talk about growth in the audiobook area, aside from mining the backlist for those opportunities, the two areas that are most often talked about are children's, especially shorter children's works. So like not Harry Potter, YA sort of, but the other stuff. Interestingly, just a funny anecdote, I was at Book Expo America, and a panel of agents talked about how they were able to sell the rights for a children's picture book that had no words in it. and the other panelists responded by saying, "Take the money and run."
It must have been really great pictures.
Someone speculated that maybe with the new Alexa, what is it? There's a screen-based Alexa.
Oh, I didn't know.
I'm not familiar with it, but maybe it was for that device. I don't know. In any event,
at what point is that not just a television, though?
Exactly, or a big iPad or something. Yeah, that's kind of what it looks like, I think.
Interesting.
So the two growth areas: children's, shorter children's, and also short nonfiction works. So I think publishers have usually gone for fiction. If I had to guess, anecdotally speaking, I think they've tended to go to the fiction first and then nonfiction next. Although business has always been a very profitable area for audiobooks, even back to books on tape, because traveling businessmen, listening to things in the car. But there's a publisher, Blinkist, I think they're UK based, that is doing some interesting work in basically offering really quick takes of nonfiction books. They can be consumed in 15 minutes. So if there's this 200 or 300 page business book in audio form, they're going to tell you basically the best takeaways in 15 minutes.
I'm sure the author's real pleased with that.
I hope they're licensing that or paying some sort of fee. But here's the interesting bit. With the audiobook growth, they are now including audiobooks in the service, and they've had a lot of success upselling people onto audiobooks. And again, they're dealing mainly in nonfiction, and they have a very loyal base. So it's really interesting to see the audiobook market grow, because we're seeing players from outside traditional publishing get it, like take up pieces of this market that might have belonged to the big five, and they're just bringing different mindsets, different talent, different ways of working and thinking about the product. So it'll just be fascinating. I think you mentioned earlier about the podcast market. Maybe how has that played into all of this? And that's another area that everyone's looking at closely, because podcasts in the US have often been free. Even though Spotify has a paid subscription now, most people expect to listen for free. So how is that going to affect what happens in audiobooks? How will these things merge or complement one another? So far, no one senses cannibalization, but I know it remains a worry.
Yeah. In terms of production for audio, how far away do you think we are from prices going down with a more AI-driven audiobook narration? Do you think, I think that there'll always be room for that really well done traditional audiobook, but there might be like the cheaper option that is AI-driven. Right. Do you think the same sort of thing, or how far away do you feel like that is? Because I don't think the technology is like quite there yet. But.
Right. We're really close, and there are people who think this is going to be the way to go, probably within 2 years, maybe.
Wow.
Well, the way to go for someone who doesn't have the money to hire Patrick Stewart to read their sonnets or something.
I've just got this book of sonnets and I just can't get them sent to him.
So it's I think it's something I would totally use, like for something like if I wanted to create an audio edition of my newsletter, The Hot Sheet,
Yeah.
to save myself the time, if the AI felt good enough, I would do it. I mean, even now, I think Alexa and some other services will read things to you. I mean, it's not going to sound like the greatest thing on earth, but sometimes it's good enough to get the job done.
I think it will be great for independent authors to have that ability to be in the market without having potentially the upfront cost that's there.
Exactly.
And like, there's definitely room for more content growth. Speaking of your newsletter, kind of being with the audio, I was chatting to an author recently that said that she has actually started sending an audio version of some of her newsletters for accessibility, to try and make sure that she's hitting everyone that wants to read their newsletter or move into audio, or just that has these problems. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I kind of forgot that until right now, that it's a really clever thing to start doing, I think.
Yeah, I think Amazon even offers a plugin, if I'm not mistaken, it's for WordPress sites. I think it's called Polly. I think it's free to use. It will take your blog posts and read them in some sort of AI voice. It's worth checking out for those who have an active blog with an active readership. I totally agree on the accessibility piece. It's a wonderful thing to offer.
Yeah, and especially with I wanted to talk about newsletters a little bit. So if we can talk about kind of marketing for indie authors with their books. So you have a blog and a website at janefriedman.com that's super popular and has always been sort of like a great source of material. Do you find that like, I feel like a few years ago, if you were an independent author trying to gain your footing, you had to have a blog. Like that had to be what you did. Do you think that people are reading them less because of newsletters, or are they reading them the same amount?
Yeah, I think if we talk about blogging in the original sense of it, like going back to 2001, where people were really writing personal logs, and it was really kind of a day-to-day, here's what's happening now, that has really gone by the wayside. And to the extent that it happens now, I do think it happens in the email newsletter for sure. There are people using things like Substack or Patreon to facilitate those more personal exchanges with fans and readers. And then I think the blogging that does happen now is typically more, if it's going to be meaningful from a strategic or from a readership perspective, it tends to be very SEO oriented. So what's going to get me traffic from Google or Bing or wherever. So that's, I mean, my site and my blog, it's definitely successful because I'm paying attention to what's going to bring me search traffic. It's not about necessarily being more personal. That goes in my newsletter.
So do you think it's essential for an author to have a blog these days?
I don't think so. No. I mean, for nonfiction authors, it can be a really important way to build a platform, but there are lots of ways to build a platform. It doesn't have to be a blog. It could be a podcast. It could be a YouTube series. It could be an email newsletter. So it just really depends on where the author feels they can sustain the effort for the longest period of time, because, this is not an overnight job.
Yeah.
And, I think blogging, it requires someone who can write quickly, that's not going to like feverishly struggle. There's no concerns about perfection.
Yeah.
That you can just write it, post it, and then move on to the next thing the next day. And I find that some writers just really, they just spend too much time on it, and it's not worth it.
Yeah, I mean, procrastination, it's an easy thing to do. Maybe they have a deadline as well. They're just like, not going to finish that book. I'm just going to spend far too much time on this blog post. Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess it's probably just really important for an author to have like a good centralized hub of an author website and platform, I guess. But
yeah, definitely have an author website. No question about that part.
Yeah. You just like buy your domain immediately.
Yes.
Yes. Do you think that, so with newsletters being the kind of main source of, not main source, but I think they have, I guess, sort of replaced the engagement that we would see with blogs. So it's essential for an author to have a newsletter is sort of what I'm asking, I guess.
I mean, I think it's pretty critical. Any successful independent author is going to tell you that their newsletter is probably the #1 way that they can get book sales up, because you can tie it so directly to, on the day that I'm, sent out my newsletter, I saw sales go up at Amazon, or I saw attention, or whatever your call to action was, you see a direct result. So I use my email newsletter predominantly as, it's about reader engagement and making impressions and being top of mind for folks. So long time brand building. As far as a hard sales perspective, it's about getting people to join an online class, or maybe they're going to subscribe to Hot Sheet or something. So for me, if I didn't have the newsletter to help with that, I would not have probably even 25% of the enrollment I enjoy on my online classes. So these are mainly webinars.
Yeah.
It's social media is totally unreliable. It's especially Facebook. It's not reaching that many people.
Yeah.
I don't do paid advertising at all.
Oh, interesting. How come?
So because I don't need to.
Yeah, I guess.
I guess I could make more money if I considered it, but I'm making enough. Like, I don't have to make the maximum amount.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's almost all email marketing that sustains my business. I'm a big believer in it.
And had you always been using email marketing in this way, or is this something that you saw as an important thing to have and increasing recently?
My understanding of email goes back to my time at FNW Media, which had a really good email marketing system or plan in place, unlike other book publishers. They had direct to consumer marketing because they had magazines, they had book clubs, consumer book clubs, and they had online subscriptions like writersmarket.com and online education. So they had a really robust consumer email newsletter base. And I saw the power of that on a regular basis. It wasn't me doing the emails. There was a marketing department that handled it. But Writer's Digest had a weekly email newsletter that was editorial in nature, but also always had a key promotional item. There was a prompts newsletter. There was a self-publishing newsletter, and you could just see what a difference that made to having success with your product launches of any kind.
Nice. What we always advise people to do with any of their marketing, whether it's newsletters or social, is especially as a wide author, to make sure you are linking to all of the places where your books are. So if you're selling your books on Kobo, you have to tell your readers that your books are on Kobo.
Yes.
What are some mistakes that you see people making with their emails? Well, let's talk about newsletters specifically, I guess, or areas to improve.
Yeah. So, boy, where to begin?
What about all caps subjects? With thoughts on that?
Oh, goodness. So I think one thing you have to immediately understand, and I don't know how well, even after I tell people, I still don't see evidence they've grasped this entirely. Images don't always load when people get emails. So every email client is different. There is literally nothing you can do to ensure images load. So that means your email has to make sense and have strong messaging, even if the images don't load. That makes it also really important that you don't use images as buttons. So it will just create confusion and likely really reduce your success with any sort of call to action. So that means you want, when you're doing an email preview, you want to somehow, usually most email services will do this, you want to preview it with the images off and see how well it reads. And then when you do have a call to action of any kind, make it a button. Buttons will still show up, and they're HTML based, so that will almost always render properly, regardless of the email client. If you're worried about the button not showing up, or the buttons, as the case may be, then just put them in text links. So just to make sure that those aren't missed. Some of the other issues that come into play is people just get a little too chaotic with the formatting and the design. And so this also goes back to just images not loading. People include too many images and use them as a crutch. But likewise, you don't want to have like 3, 4, or 5 different fonts. You don't want to keep changing the size of the text and the orientation, like have it center and then left aligned and then right aligned. So you want to keep it very simple, block format. Think about it as horizontal stacking of elements rather than creating lots of columns and things that are busy and people might just be confused by. Let's see. What else? I mean, there's certainly like larger picture issues related to email newsletter sends that are about retaining the health of the list. So making sure that you're not adding people who didn't ask to be added, having good practices in terms of double opt-in. It also helps, especially depending on how you're acquiring names, like maybe you're acquiring people onto your list because they took advantage of a freebie, like you offered a free ebook and now they're on your list. It really helps to have some sort of onboarding process where you send them 1, 2, or 3 messages before they're really on your list to make sure that you're vetting them and qualifying them as good prospects, because to maintain an email list costs money. And you don't want a lot of dead weight on the list of people who all they wanted was the freebie and they're really not interested in anything else. And you want them to drop off, in other words, rather than retain them. When you do send emails, if you're able to segment the list, that will improve response. By segment, I mean, when you bring people onto a list, you can usually, in any email service, tag them or categorize them based on how they ended up on the list or what they're interested in. So there's some metadata associated with that sign up, and you can then use that when you send out emails to make sure you're only speaking to the people who are interested. So this would become really important, for instance, if you're writing 2 different series, or if you have something that's more romantic suspense, and then you have something that's more, let's say, science fiction fantasy. Speaking to those audiences together might not be to your benefit. And so that's what I mean by segmenting.
I think that's great. I always personally like when I sign up for a newsletter and it does have a couple of questions, like I think it's good to think about yourself as the reader. Like I want to know exactly what I'm getting when I do sign up for something. So that's great advice. Rich has a question here asking if you know of any writers working together in one newsletter.
So these would be 2 authors working together?
We definitely see newsletter swaps from time to time, but I'm not too sure if that's like a regular occurrence. That would be kind of interesting.
Yeah, I've certainly seen it with journalists who collaborate on newsletters because they're both invested in a similar topic or beat. So like, for instance, Nicholas Qua, we were talking about podcasts. Nicholas Qua is like the podcast industry expert. He's like my kind of corollary for podcasts. And he definitely has contributors and people that he works with to do his newsletter. I don't often see authors partnering, but I don't see why you couldn't if you're speaking to a similar readership. And as you mentioned, there are lots of people doing swaps. And if you're curious about where to find swap mates, Story
like
Origin.
that term.
Yeah, Story Origin is a really good service for surfacing those opportunities.
Nice. One thing I did want to ask your opinion on is that you mentioned it really briefly about Patreon. And I want to see, how are you noticing authors using this more and more? What are some kind of interesting ways? Just why do you think it's more of a service that people are interested in?
It allows you to very easily, without having any tech knowledge, start basically a pledge model. So like a PBS fund drive, sort of imagine that, and get people to donate anywhere from $1 to $100 or more per month to support your creative work. Most people have a really core group of loyal fans who they're not even interested in getting something for their money every month. They just want to support you doing what you do. There are those sorts of wonderful angel investors out there, patrons.
Yeah, I love the idea of patrons coming back.
Yeah, exactly. So I've seen very successful authors use it and emerging authors use it. So for example, Joanna Penn, who's really well known in the indie author community, uses her Patreon specifically to fund her podcast. And so if you go to her page, you'll see that there are various perks associated with supporting that effort. I've seen a literary novelist, Monica Byrne, her last name is spelled Byrne. She launched a page not around the time that her first novel came out. Very literary novel, won lots of critical acclaim, but I'd be surprised if it's bringing her sizable royalty checks. And so I think she was very astute and, probably launched this knowing that it could become an important way to support her literary work that's not very commercial in nature. Last time I checked, she was in the $3,000 a month ballpark for this. And I think it's because, she's found the people who know that literary work doesn't pay and they want to ensure that she's going to produce that next book. In the science fiction fantasy side, Jason Sanford does a really interesting newsletter out of his Patreon page. So you'll see that he does a number of things depending on which level you're signed up for. He had one level that I have signed up for is something, his genre grapevine column, where he does some reporting on what's happening in the science fiction and fantasy genre. Very useful, by the way, for anyone who's in that genre. Sign up. If you're at a higher level, then you get some of his own science fiction fantasy work for free. So like short stories and things of that nature. So he's done really well, and word spreads a lot about his Patreon because of the genre grapevine column. So it's really interesting how that's a nice publicity factor for the other work that he does.
Nice. Yeah, I'm interested to see how Patreon keeps kind of growing and how authors are constantly innovating and using these new things that are available.
Yeah, it's really limited to your imagination. It's a really flexible platform.
Nice. We have a question here from Ruth that is asking, is there any data to support an argument that self-publishing is more successful financially for authors in the US rather than the UK? Or any data on Australia to compare?
I haven't seen any data to support that, but you certainly do see a predominant number of the self-publishing success stories in the United States and then in the UK. But whether there might be some in Australia, but I don't live there, and so that's probably why I'm not noticing or seeing them, because I'm not following Australia publishing news that closely. So they would have to succeed on a level that it hit the news outlets that I'm watching.
Yeah.
Or they would have to be hitting the bestseller lists in the US or the UK, which I certainly know that because ebook adoption rates are greater in the United States and the UK, you do find that authors from around the globe are trying to get on those bestseller lists because that's where the money is. There's just a bigger audience to pull from. But I don't know that I would say US authors necessarily have an edge on UK authors, except to the extent that you might see a market size difference between the two places. But I tend to see authors selling well in both markets, but it's obviously going to depend on the genre and some other factors about consumer market.
Yeah, I tend to see it as well as that I think in the US was maybe the earliest adopter of self-publishing. So, and like the quickest to change. So whenever I think about it, I sort of think about North America in kind of as being, the first place, and then the rest, not that they're catching up, but there's just a slight delay. So
yeah, but I mean, in the UK, there's Mark Dawson, who was recently in the news.
I saw that
for buying his way onto the London Times list. There's Joanna Penn, there's Orna Ross, and others who have done very well.
Yeah.
But it's, you make an important point that these tools came to the US first, I think. And so US authors have had maybe a longer runway.
And I also think that maybe, that like traditional publishing is slower to change in the UK. Like not that there's like a stigma with self-publishing. I think that's sort of ending now, hopefully. But that would have been slower to overcome outside of North America.
Yeah. I think the authors, I feel, I don't want to say I feel sorry for them. I just know that they have a significant challenge ahead of them. If you're a self-publishing author writing in French, Spanish, Italian, German, those are the markets where I find it's really tough. and the progress has been slow. And part of it just relates to the rate of ebook adoption and some just the cultures there, I think, don't lend themselves as well. But, you do see the occasional story of people breaking out.
I think that's what's interesting about the pandemic as well, though. I think it's actually accelerated some of the digital reading adoption in these areas. So yeah, I'm curious to see what will kind of happen as a result.
Yeah.
So if we kind of think about, I say traditional publishers, but I just mean sort of people with a publishing background. What do you think that traditional publishers learn from self-publishers and vice versa? Because I think I'm noticing more and more indie authors researching more on kind of like, oh, well, how did like traditional publishers do this thing 20 years ago? And then I think traditional publishers are kind of like, all right, what's the latest thing that indies are doing? So yeah, how do you think they're learning from one another?
Certainly traditional publishers have typically been slow to really look at pricing as a way to increase market, to increase sales, to increase visibility, but they've definitely been much more adept, I think, of late. So they're taking advantage of things like BookBub deals. Those that are really conscientious are pushing more buttons and levers in terms of promotional pricing. Elsewhere, using a first-in series or selling a previous book from the author in the lead up to a launch of a new title. So I've certainly seen that. Those tactics are very familiar to traditional publishers now. Whether self-publishers did them first, I don't know, but it always feels to me like self-publishers have competed more on price than traditional publishers. Something that I haven't seen that I wish there were more of, and maybe I'm just not paying close enough attention, is traditional publishers helping their debut novelists with more promotional pricing or pricing that's lower that helps reduce the risk of people taking a chance on those authors. I just think it's really hard for a new novelist with a $12 or $14.99 ebook to compete against all the other stuff out there. So that's a lesson I wish that they would pick up. What else? Certainly they might be doing more with series now than they used to. I think self-publishers are much more likely to invest in a very long-term series and to stick with that series and then do spin-off series. And I don't see traditional publishers, prior to I don't know, maybe the mid-2010s, I just didn't see that prevalence as much. But I'm seeing more of that. What else? I think I'm drawing a blank at the moment.
Oh, that's okay. No, this is great.
If there are things that you've noticed, I'd love to hear them.
I do think that the pricing thing for sure, I think traditional publishers are still a bit afraid of using a free book as a pricing or as a kind of marketing model. But the biggest thing I think I've noticed is just the expectation of the author having already created their base,
Yes.
Yeah, because indies are so good at kind of like finding their readers and kind of working on that. So I do see an increase more and more in it being hybrid, which I think is probably the way forward. Like if you really want to get like a print book in store as an indie, I think it's really probably beneficial to have this sort of hybrid publishing relationship. But so yeah, I think that would be it. Kind of just the expectation of more marketing, I guess. So we just have a few minutes left, and as I said I'm going to ask your predictions, but we could just do for the rest of this year if that's easier, or where do you see publishing going in general?
Well, the pandemic, of course, introduces a lot of questions about long-term, how will this affect the industry? I think that audio is going to continue on its growth path. It's going to continue to be important. Publishers and authors both, they're going to continue to invest. There are also going to be some outside players, as we mentioned earlier, that may give some traditional publishers a run for their money. They might, Audible, of course, already does a lot of their own original content, but it'll just be interesting to see how that market matures.
Yeah, we have our Kobo original content too that's sort of growing. So I'm curious to see, because a lot of our stuff is focused on non-English. So
yes,
yeah.
yes, exactly. So definitely have an eye on how audio is maturing. Ebooks now are in kind of a growth situation because it's harder to get print. How much is that going to continue? I feel like it might be a blip. I don't know that people are going to stick with ebooks once print becomes more readily available. I mean, I used to be of the mind that ebooks would be a much, much bigger market share than they currently enjoy. And, print is staying predominant for very specific economic reasons, because publishers price ebooks higher. Because if you shop at Amazon and you see the print book cheaper than the ebook, you're going to buy print. So there are reasons print has remained robust. So I'm always watching that tension or that friction, because the more that Amazon kind of eats up market share, how is that going to affect the print, ebook, audio format divide? How is that going to affect how publishers focus their marketing? And I realize I'm talking more about questions raised rather than actual
that's okay.
predictions. But I think so okay. So here's just a little. I don't know if I want to call it a warning, but just a very interesting development where McGraw-Hill, one of the major publishers, ended its agreement with Audible to sell audiobooks through the site, which is a pretty big deal in my mind. They couldn't agree to terms.
Yeah.
And are we about to see more and more publishers basically start to get into this uncomfortable situation with Audible where they don't like the terms anymore and they're willing to just sell elsewhere? And how does that affect Amazon's market share? And how does that affect the entirety of the industry when so much of the market is wrapped up in what Amazon is doing, at least in the United States? So how much are they going to tighten the screws? And how does that affect what publishers do to sell either outside of Amazon or to just increase their ability to do better through Amazon?
Yeah. When you were saying there about the ebook kind of increase now, whether or not it'll kind of keep, when Kobo started, we're in our 11th year now, but we always kind of considered this like a 25-year digital reading revolution. So it's kind of, I think, good to keep it in mind of like, there's still some ways to go, but we feel confident that it'll be, as we see like more countries adopting it as well, they'll like further increase.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I'm an ebook first reader. I don't typically pick up print books unless there's, I don't know, I want the first edition from a favorite author or something like that. I think another issue with, just to talk about like way out into the future about ebooks, I'm kind of disappointed at the development of the ebook format, EPUB. I don't think it's really progressed much. And I don't know whose fault this is. Maybe nobody's fault. But
I think there's a real lack of adoption to new formats. So I think when you look at the Kobo store, so I used to work on the EPUBs, which is why like I could talk about EPUBs all day long. But when you look at our store is predominantly still EPUB 2, and we're really trying to push people toward even like adopting EPUB 3. So I think without there being a broader adoption of like a current format, we can't move to like an EPUB 4.
Yes. Yeah, so that's the other issue where I think, if the ebook format, had features, or it just felt like, oh my gosh, it would bring me so much more benefit to read this in digital format, that could certainly help.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. So we're kind of over our hour. We'll wrap things up now. And if anyone is interested in kind of getting in touch with you or following what you're doing, where can they learn more about you?
Best place to go is janefriedman.com. So you'll find all the stuff I do right on that site.
Awesome. And thanks very much, Jane, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thanks for the comments and to the viewers. And we'll see you guys next month, hopefully. So thank you.
Thank you, Tara.